Good morning. Thank you all for showing up at 9 a.m. I just arrived here. I was noticing your breakfast buffet, the music. I have to tell you, your events are a lot better than academic conferences, I can tell you. I only have 15 minutes, and for academics, it's quite hard to be on point. So let me dive right in and try to actually stick to the time slot that I have. I want to start here. Who of you recognizes the weird domain name at the top right corner? Yeah, just yell it out. WannaCry, of course. So this was the weird kill switch domain, sandbox evasion thingy that the guy built into WannaCry. Then there was also the rather poorly designed payment module associated with WannaCry. The only thing that was sort of cool about it was Eternal Blue, right? It was using this thing from the Shadow Brokers leaks. But still, even by the time this thing showed up, the patch had been out for what, 3 months? So how is it then possible that even a few months after WannaCry, we have Petya, non-Petya, and we have a company like Maersk, heavily disrupted. Let me put it euphemistically. How is that possible? Don't these guys know about this thing called patching? So usually when I put this question, we don't really have an opportunity here to discuss it. When I put this question to an audience, I'm really curious to see how they explain this. How do you explain a company like Maersk not patching this and then, suffering the obvious consequence of this vulnerability being exploited? Now, most of the answers I get, if you drill them down to their essence, they either blame it on incompetence or lack of resources. So I'm going to assume a lot of the answers that you're thinking about are in those two categories too. If you have another answer, please approach me afterwards. I would love to hear it. I'm going to give you my alternative answer, which is this whole mess is actually the outcome of a very rational process. This is not a mistake in the sense of somebody didn't do their job. It's obviously, in hindsight, an outcome that they would have wanted to prevent. I think we can all agree on this. But of course, in hindsight, we are all experts, right? The question is, what were they doing at the time when these decisions had to be made? And that explanation actually takes us into economics, into incentives. So what do we know about patching? Well, patching is a mess. Patching breaks things. If you run an enterprise-grade type of environment like Maersk, you have so many dependencies that anything you roll out might push over a bunch of boxes on the other side of the network, might render certain critical services unavailable. And in fact, just to illustrate this, we did a study a few years ago at a large telco and looked at their biggest outages, like the ones where tens of thousands of customers were offline for prolonged periods. The number one cause of this was patching. It wasn't attacks, it wasn't people ripping cables from, the groundworks or whatever. It was their own patching processes. And this was after all kinds of testing and change management procedures and all this stuff. So patching is really hard. Now combine this with how much you would have to patch if you really did what we security people tell them to do, namely, patch, you have to be relatively aggressive in patching. Depending on whose counts you look at, I have a small graph at the bottom of the slide there. We are now talking about over 20,000 vulnerabilities every year that you have to patch. So then look at this from the perspective of Maersk, okay? So they now have to evaluate hundreds of vulnerabilities every day and potentially patch a whole lot of them. Now, to summarize the effect of then doing what we tell them to do, namely patch your vulnerabilities, what they would end up doing is DDoSing their own organization. If you patch hundreds of vulnerabilities every day, you are DDoSing your own organization. Now, if that is the alternative scenario, then suffering an outage of a week, 2 weeks, is actually the preferred outcome. You see my point? in hindsight, we could say, yeah, obviously the eternal blue thingy should have been patched. Come on, guys. But beforehand, it's not that clear. Oh, but what about CVSS, right? We give all these vulnerabilities a nice little score so you can actually triage what you should be patching. CVSS, I don't know if you guys actually follow the discussion on this. There's some really cool academic literature on this. CVSS is broken for a variety of reasons. Again, economics. Most people who rate CVSS, who produce CVSS ratings, have an incentive to overestimate the criticality of the vulnerability. This is not because they're evil or mean or stupid. No, it's because, for example, if you discovered it, you're more likely to think this is an important vulnerability than not. Let's be honest, we're all humans. The other thing is, if you're a software vendor, let's say you're Microsoft, somebody gives you one of these vulnerabilities, you now have to write the patch, deploy it, and inform your customers. You are going to err on the side of caution. You're going to say, we rate this thing as critical, you should patch it. Why? Because giving it a rating of critical doesn't cost you anything. All the costs are on the side of the company. They now have to patch, they have to disrupt their processes, and all the benefits are on your side, because if you don't rate the vulnerability as highly critical, somebody will come back to you and say, why are you underplaying the risks to your own software? So all the incentives come together here to make patching a very much unsolved problem, and it's sort of remarkable how little guidance we provide companies with to actually solve this. If this is the state of the art, then, Maersk and Petra is inevitable. And it's not even a failure. This is just normal operating procedure. So this is one nutshell story telling you why everywhere in cybersecurity there are incentives that actually drive a lot of the security practices that we care about. I have a small team in Delft that researches this in a variety of markets. So we measure. That's our thing. We don't hack. We look at the stuff that you guys hack. Then we try to measure this at scale. Where are these boxes, et cetera, et cetera. And then we try to explain why certain security threats behave differently, why some networks are more vulnerable than others, et cetera. I'll skip this for the sake of time, but the takeaway of this slide is lots of stuff happens on the left side in, let's say, core computer security. We discover incidents, vulnerabilities, malicious, IOCs, all that stuff. And what we do, this is actually very time-consuming work, is we map all this data onto actual real-world actors. Providers, service, different kind of vendors, different types of user communities, different kind of countries, international institutions, etc. And that way, we can try to understand what incentives actually shape how we deal with these threats. So I'm going to take you through a number of interesting findings that we have in terms of what kind of incentives help cybersecurity. One is peer pressure. We took a whole bunch of sinkhole data and other stuff that tracks botnets. This is actually where a lot of this work started. We mapped it to ISPs, so not autonomous systems, no, to the actual ISPs. We bought some ridiculously expensive market data and mapped all the autonomous systems onto this market data, yada, yada, yada. And now we had infection rates per subscriber for each ISP. And then you can make nice plots like this. And if you take this to ISPs, they're actually often very surprised because, ISPs are, the people working at ISPs, they're human, contrary to what you might have heard. And they have the classical fallacy that we all have, which is, 80% of the people think they're above average intelligent, right? So 50% of them are wrong. And this is all of us. We all make mistakes like this. And ISPs do. They think they're doing well, they care, they put resources into it, and then they're surprised to see that their competitor has 10 times, 100 times, some of these, this is a logarithmic scale, 1,000 times fewer infections per subscriber than they have. So clearly those guys are doing something more efficient, more effective than you are doing. So you don't need to name and shame them, you just need to show them this, and many of these companies would actually start to act. And this is one of the reasons why in the Netherlands we now have a centralized clearinghouse for abuse data that ISPs use to clean up end-user machines, and we are now among the cleanest countries in the world in terms of broadband consumer networks. I'm going to skip this. Go to the second one, naming and shaming. So it's a little bit the same. You measure what companies are actually doing, but now you take a public approach to it. Name, shame, praise, whatever you want to call it. So we first tried this with bad hosting, with malicious hosting. There was a great presentation later today on this as well. You should definitely attend that. The Netherlands has a bit of a reputation, let me put it this way, in terms of malicious hosting. Every industry report, we are in the top 3, top 5 worst, or best, whatever you want to call it, malware distributing countries, child pornography, all that stuff. So the police was sort of fed up with this, and they came to us asking, how can we disrupt this? And I said, well, who do you want to disrupt? Like, what is the actual target here? And they had some names, but that's basically gossip, right? Everybody talks about provider X as being bad, but where's the proof? What is the actual data? So what we did for them is very simple. We took a whole range of abuse feeds for hosting abuse. You see them listed there. We mapped them onto the providers. We controlled for the attack surface of the providers. Simply said, if you're larger, you have more hacked sites. If you have more shared hosting, you have more hacked sites, WordPress and all that. And then you can actually rank the relative, let's say, pollution that this network has. And then you get plots like this, which you then translate after a lot of other stuff into, in this case, this rather abstract picture, which is the top 20 worst, most polluted, most crime-facilitating hosting providers in the Netherlands. The police sent them a letter saying, hi, we are the Dutch police. TU Delft has decided that you are in the top 10 worst providers in the Netherlands. So that, of course, triggered a few phone calls to me, like, what the hell have you guys been smoking? I said, why don't you come over to Delft? We'll drink some coffee and talk it through. And the few companies that did come, actually, it was a very constructive conversation. Did it work? Did the police sort of soft pressure intervention work? Not really. A few became better. They cared. They just had a different understanding of what they were doing than what they were actually doing. That's great. Others didn't give a shit. There were even people that said, if you have something signed by a judge, there's the mailbox. Otherwise, don't bother me. Okay. So on the worst side of the market, doesn't really work so well, the naming and shaming. Now we are actually going to the rest of the market, which is, of course, 95%, if not more, where people just try to run a business, a bona fide business. So we took a better version of the same way to produce this security metric, this pollution metric, let's say. And there's lots of cool stuff behind this, which I obviously cannot go into. And now we have a security benchmark that's actually highly reliable for over 40,000 hosting providers in the world. And we're now sharing it with the Dutch hosting sector to see if we can get the same sort of self-improvement cycle going that the ISPs went through. And one way to capture this incentive mechanism is to basically say, we are escalating their self-commitment. So these companies think they're doing well, we confront them with actual data, they then decide that they actually are not doing so well and they want to do something better. That seems to work quite well. We'll see if this also is going to fly here. Another incentive mechanism, we've been waiting for this for years. It's finally sort of showing up, liability. Whoever creates the problem should fix the problem. This still doesn't work so well. Some of you may know that the Dutch consumer organization, Consumentenbond, they have an ongoing court case against Samsung for not patching their, Android phones, which is sort of insane if you think about it, right? Google gives them the patch. They cannot even be bothered just to test the patch for their own, we're not talking about some Galaxy Nexus from 10 years ago. We're talking about, the current models that they have. And then to send out the patch. The fact that you have to go to court to get a patch from your vendor is insane. So this shows you that liability is a problem, but not everywhere, because when their Note 7 went up in flames, suddenly they were very aggressive in patching. And one thing they did is the few people that hung on to their Note 7s, they actually pushed the patch, whether these people wanted it or not, turning off charging on the device. So they would brick your device. Why? Well, because they don't want to be liable in case you actually burn yourself with that thing. Because liability law works very well once you have physical damage, either in terms of health or in terms of goods. And another area where we've seen this work really well is cars. Some vulnerability gets discovered in the Jeep Cherokee, over 1 million cars are recalled. You can bet that that works very well as an economic incentive. These guys are paying more attention now to how to design the security than they were before. We can also put it to the network operators, intermediate liability. We are working with the ISPs to clean up IoT. All the IoT that we see show up in IoT honeypots, 80%, the green part, is actually in ISP networks. And that's great because they already are doing botnet cleanup, so they can do this too, and they're willing to help. Last mechanism, this sounds extremely soft. I never believed in it, but there's some evidence here. Social norms, events like this, events like MOG, etc., etc. People meet, they have a conversation, they decide they have to do something. So if you send out abuse notifications of hacked websites, most providers will act. That's the takeaway from this. I'll spare you the reading. Another one is, BCP 38, anti-spoofing. That's, from an economics perspective, a ridiculous thing to do. It has no benefits to you as a network operator. It only has costs, and all the benefits go to the rest of the internet. And yet, half of the networks are doing it. Over half of the networks are doing it. The question isn't, why are the others not doing it? No, the question is, why are half of them doing it at all? And I think the only answer we have there is social norms. So these are all incentive mechanisms. There are certification and standards. I'll skip that. And there are other mechanisms that we're trying to now see so that in the end, of course, we can take these and build more robust incentives for companies to actually make the right decisions when it comes to cybersecurity. Thank you very much.